Here's another leather mask making tutorial. The pattern for this mask is available. I did modify the pattern after making this to make the tendrils a little easier to cut out. I would not call this an easy mask as it involves some tricky X-Acto knife work and lots of use of a swivel knife. However, because it is not symmetrical and it's made up of natural shapes, it would be a great mask if you're looking to practice your X-Acto knife cutting skills and your swivel knife skills. With the exception of the eye holes, if your lines are off, it really doesn't matter. So here I'm starting on the mask. I printed out my pattern and now I'm just trimming the middle edges so that I can tape it together easily. Lining everything up and then just taping it where it's going to join. I'm just roughly trimming the edges of the pattern so that each section is just separate from each other. Cutting out the flowers. Finding pieces of leather that will work. Here I am just tracing around the flowers 7 times so that I have each one. Right now the leather's dry, so I'm just tracing around it with a dull pencil. There they are. When you're choosing your leather, you want to check and make sure if there's any marks or scars that you're cutting around them. Also check the backside, because sometimes there's marks there that aren't visible at the front. Just roughly tracing around the outside so I can separate a piece of leather from the main hide. Now I'm dipping the leather into some water. You can see that bubbles are rising, and you want to let it sit until the bubbles stop rising, and that's how you know that the leather is completely saturated all the way through. Personally, if I'm just doing tooling and I'm not shaping, I don't wet my leather all the way through. However, if I am shaping, I do wet it all the way through and then let it dry down before I tool. Now I'm starting to cut things out, so I'm cutting out my flowers first. You can see the leather's still really wet here. It will be easier to cut out when it's dry, so if you're doing complicated cutting where precision is super important, I recommend doing it when it's dry. I'm just placing the tip of the X-Acto knife into the corners and then cutting towards the edges. And now I'm punching holes. You can see I'm using a hand grip hole punch. If you're purchasing your first punch, I do recommend getting the kind that you hammer with a mallet. It's just more versatile and allows you to punch holes further away from the edge of the leather. Now I'm just tracing the pattern onto the leather. I'm using a stylus here. You can also use a dull pencil. A pencil is nice because you can see which lines you've already traced. And I'm tracing all of the details, including the veins. And now I'm cutting the vine, again, sticking the tip of my X-Acto knife into the corner and cutting towards the edges. So here's the vine all cut out. Just looking at this, I'd say the leather is wetter than I would normally like for swivel knife cutting, but this project is tricky. You have all these small little pieces and you want to finish the swivel knife cutting before everything dries too much to do the shaping. So I am doing my swivel knife cutting a little bit wetter than I normally would. Just doing the veins in the leaves and the bark texture here. There's the flowers all done and the vine. Now I'm tracing the main mask. I did adjust the pattern a bit after making this myself so that it's easier to cut out. Now I'm starting to shape the flowers. Really, this is just freehand. You can do whatever you like. I'm just twisting and folding to give them some shape. Here they are all shaped. I'm just going to set them aside to dry. Now I'm shaping the vine. I'm just folding the leaves back and rounding the bark portion just so it looks sort of like a branch. These are all organic shapes, so there's no right or wrong way to do it. Now I'm coming into the main mask with a swivel knife. Again, this leather is a lot wetter than I would recommend for swivel knife cutting. There it is all carved, and now I'm going to start cutting it out. This is tricky, so just take your time. And I'm twisting the tendrils up. Now these thin pieces are going to dry so much faster than the middle of the mask, so you really want to start with the narrow, thin bits and sort of work your way inwards. I'm just shaping as I go because otherwise they're going to dry too fast. Cutting the eyes out is the only part of this that actually requires precision. All the rest of this is organic shapes, so there's really no way to mess it up. I'm starting to shape the mask. One of these foam heads you can get at the craft store is super helpful, or you can just use your own face. Now I'm feeding the vines through these holes and shaping them around. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I just sort of bent them however I felt like and tucked them into the holes. Now I'm fine-tuning my little curly cues. Make sure to check your design from the sides as well, because remember this is a 3D structure. I left the leather overnight to dry. So now I'm starting to dye. I believe this is a blue EcoFlow. I don't like EcoFlow for things that require durability, like belts and stuff like that, because I find it's really not as color fast as Phoebing's, but they do have a really nice variety of colors, which is awesome for masks. This is green EcoFlow. Here I'm using a bunch of different colors of brown and building them up in layers to create a multicolored bark texture. This is a great way to use up the ends of your dye containers. Remember to do the back of the portions that stick out beyond your head because they will be visible. And I'm just fine-tuning these again because they got re-wet once the dye was on there. Here the dye is all dry and I'm covering it with a finish. You always want to use a leather finish on top of your dye. Punching holes for the flowers and the elastics. This kind of a hammer punch is a lot more versatile than the hand grip kind because you can get further from the edge of the leather. And now I am feeding the vine back through again. You'll notice I removed it for dyeing just to make my life easier. And I'm putting it back in place. Now I'm adding some extra details with acrylic paints. There are leather specific acrylic paints, but for something like this, where durability isn't too much of a concern, just cheap craft store acrylic paint is completely fine. Just dipping the corners to give the tips some color, letting them dry. Checking the location of my elastic holes. You usually want them around your temples, but I do recommend not punching them until after you've shaped your mask because you really don't know where it's going to sit on your face until you've shaped it. And I'm feeding elastic through. You can use ribbon too, but elastic is easier to put on and it's a lot more comfortable. Just tying your basic knot. And there you go, double loop of elastic. Secures really well to your head. And now I'm attaching the flowers. I've got double cap rivets here and just giving them a tap to set them in place. I've used a black rivet just to make it a little prettier. Rivets come in lots of different colors. And that's it. I make lots of stuff out of leather, so follow for more.